The winter wind cut through Chicago like a blade forged in hatred, carrying with it the kind of cold that made bones ache and memories sharpen. Snow had been falling since dawn, blanketing the city in white that would turn gray by noon, and the windows of Rosie's diner had fogged over from the warmth inside, creating a barrier between the brutal world outside and the quiet sanctuary within. The diner was a relic from another era, all chrome fixtures and red vinyl booths, the kind of place where coffee came in ceramic mugs that had seen better decades, and the pie was always fresh because the owner still believed in doing things right. At 11:43 in the morning, the lunch rush hadn't yet begun, and the establishment held only a handful of souls seeking refuge from the freeze. In the booth farthest from the door, positioned with his back to the wall and a clear sight line to every entrance and exit, sat a man who did not belong in this picture of Americana. Park Joon-ho ate his eggs with the precise, unhurried movements of someone who had learned long ago that rushing invited mistakes, and mistakes in his world invited death. He was 41 years old, his black hair silvering at the temples in a way that his lieutenant said made him look distinguished, but he knew simply made him look like what he was, a man who had survived longer than most in his profession had any right to expect. His charcoal suit cost more than the diner's monthly rent, and the watch on his wrist could have purchased the entire building outright, but he came here every Tuesday when he was in Chicago because the cook made eggs the way his grandmother had before the war had taken her, and some hungers had nothing to do with the body. His two men sat 3 booths away, close enough to respond but far enough to give him the illusion of solitude he occasionally craved. They were reading newspapers they weren't actually reading, drinking coffee they barely tasted, their eyes making the same constant calculations his own made without conscious thought. Threat assessment, exit strategies, the mathematics of violence that became as natural as breathing when you lived the life they lived. The bell above the door shattered the quiet with its cheerful chime, and Joon-ho's eyes lifted from his plate with the casual alertness of a predator noting movement in the grass. What he saw made him pause, fork hovering midway to his mouth, because the woman who had just burst through the door carried with her the unmistakable scent of fear, and fear in his experience was always the prelude to something interesting. She was beautiful in the way that stopped conversations and started wars, mid-20s with skin the color of burnished mahogany and eyes that held the particular brightness of barely controlled panic. Her light pink wool sweater was expensive but rumpled, as if she'd dressed carefully that morning for a day that had gone catastrophically wrong, and her blue jeans were damp at the cuffs from the snow she'd waded through to reach the store. She stood in the entrance for a fraction of a second, scanning the diner with the desperate efficiency of a hunted animal, and then her gaze landed on Joon-ho, and something shifted in her expression. Decision. Calculation. The desperate arithmetic of a woman out of options. She moved toward him with purpose, her boots leaving wet prints on the checkered floor, and Joon-ho set down his fork with the deliberate calm of a man who had learned that the most dangerous moments often announce themselves with beauty and desperation intertwined. His men had tensed, hands drifting toward concealed weapons, but he gave an almost imperceptible shake of his head.
Wait. Watch.
Let this play out. Baby, the woman said, loud enough to carry, sliding into the booth across from him with the familiarity of a lover. I'm so sorry I'm late. Traffic was absolutely insane. Her hands reached across the table to grasp his, and he felt them trembling, felt the cold of the outside world still clinging to her fingers, felt the rapid pulse beating against his palm. Her eyes met his, and in them he read a plea that transcended language, transcended the obvious insanity of what she was attempting. Please, she whispered, her voice dropping below the threshold of anyone else's hearing, please pretend you're my husband. Just for 5 minutes. He's coming, and I don't know what else to do. Joon-ho had built an empire on his ability to read people, to understand in an instant what motivated them, what frightened them, what they would do when pushed to their breaking point. This woman was not a threat. This woman was prey, and somewhere behind her, a predator was closing in. The calculus was simple. The decision was instant. You're freezing, sweetheart, he said, his accent lending the endearment and exotic quality as he squeezed her hands with practiced warmth. I told you to take a cab, but you never listened to me. He raised his hand, signaling the waitress with the easy authority of a man accustomed to being served. Coffee for my wife, please. She's been out in that cold too long. The relief that flooded her features was so profound it nearly broke something in his chest, something he had thought calcified beyond feeling years ago. Thank you, she breathed, the words carrying the weight of salvation. Thank you. Thank you. I'll explain everything, The bell chimed again. The man who entered brought the cold in with him like a personal atmosphere, and Junho understood immediately why the woman had run. He was American, mid-40s, wearing a tan trench coat that was too expensive to be government issue, but styled to evoke exactly that authority. Wire-rimmed glasses sat on a face that might have been handsome once, but had curdled into something cruel, the kind of face that smiled while it hurt you and believed it was doing you a favor. He moved with the confidence of someone who had never faced real consequence, scanning the diner with eyes that expected to find what they sought because they always had before. Those eyes found the woman, and the smile that spread across his face made Junho's hand itch for the gun he wasn't carrying because this was supposed to be a peaceful breakfast in a city where he was merely a visitor. Imani, the man said, walking toward their booth with the measured pace of someone savoring a victory. You really thought you could run from me? In this weather?
Sweetheart, we talked about this.
You're not thinking clearly. You're confused, and I'm here to help you. The woman, Imani, had gone rigid beside him, her hands clenching his with desperate strength. Junho could feel her pulse hammering against his skin, could see the way her breath had shortened, could read in the micro-expressions of her face a history of fear that this man had written across her psyche. He had seen that look before, in the eyes of people who had been broken by those who claimed to love them, and it woke something in him that he had thought long dormant. I'm sorry, Junho said, his voice carrying the particular politeness that his enemies had learned to fear, but I don't believe we've been introduced. You seem to know my wife, but I don't recall her mentioning you. The man in the trench coat stopped, his confident smile flickering for the first time as he processed the scene before him. The Asian man in the expensive suit, the protective positioning, the complete absence of the terror he had expected to find. Your wife. He laughed, but it was a hollow sound, uncertainty creeping in at the edges. That's adorable. Listen, friend, I don't know what she told you, but Imani and I have been together for 2 years. She's having an episode.
She does this sometimes.
I'm just here to take her home. An episode. Junho repeated, tasting the word like something rotten. He released Imani's hands gently and rose from the booth with the fluid grace of a man whose body had been trained for violence since childhood. He was not tall by Western standards, but he carried himself with a presence that made the space around him feel smaller, more dangerous. That's a fascinating diagnosis. Are you a doctor? The man's eyes narrowed behind his glasses, reassessing the situation with the dawning recognition that something was wrong with this picture. I don't see how that's any of your business. Imani, get up. We're leaving.
Now.
She's not going anywhere with you. Junho's voice hadn't risen, hadn't changed in tone or timbre, but something in it made the other patrons in the diner look up from their meals, made the waitress freeze with a coffee pot in her hand, made his 2 men rise slowly from their booth with expressions that promised nothing good. You see, my wife and I are having breakfast. We've been planning this morning for weeks. And you're interrupting. Your wife, the man laughed again, but there was no humor in it now, only the frustrated anger of someone whose script was being rewritten without his consent. Okay, I'll play along. What's her middle name? Where did you meet? What's her mother's maiden name? He crossed his arms, triumph flickering in his eyes. Go ahead. Prove it. Junho smiled, and it was the smile his enemies saw before everything went wrong for them. Her middle name is Grace, after her grandmother who raised her. We met at a charity gala in Manhattan 3 years ago. She was wearing a green dress that made her look like spring had walked into the room. Her mother's maiden name was Williams, and her mother made the best sweet potato pie in all of Georgia before she passed. He stepped closer to the man, close enough to smell his cologne, close enough to see the first flicker of genuine fear in his eyes. Her favorite flower is the peony. She takes her coffee with 2 sugars and a splash of cream. She hates horror movies but loves true crime documentaries, and she talks in her sleep about places she wants to visit another step closer. I know everything about my wife. The question is, who are you and why are you harassing her? The fabrications had spilled from his lips with the practiced ease of a man who had built a career on convincing people of impossible things, and he watched with satisfaction as the doubt crept into the stranger's expression. Behind him, Imani had pressed her hand to her mouth, her eyes wide with something that might have been hope. "This is insane," the man sputtered, but his voice had lost its commanding edge. "Imani, tell him. Tell him the truth right now, or I swear to God." "Or you'll what?" Junho's voice dropped to something barely above a whisper, something intimate and terrifying. "Please, finish that sentence." "I'm very curious to hear what you'll do to my wife in front of me and my associates." He tilted his head toward his men, who had positioned themselves between the booth and the door, their postures relaxed, but their eyes promising violence. "We have nothing but time." The man looked at the two Korean men blocking his exit, looked at Junho's pleasant smile that didn't reach his eyes, looked at Imani who had finally stopped trembling and was staring at her tormentor with something approaching defiance. The mathematics of the situation were clearly computing behind his glasses, and Junho watched him reach the correct conclusion. This was not a fight he could win. "This isn't over," he said, pointing at Imani with a finger that shook slightly despite his attempt at menace. "You can't hide behind this circus act forever. I'll find you. I always find you." He turned to Junho, and there was something ugly and promising in his expression. "And you, whoever you are, you just made a very big mistake. You have no idea who you're dealing with." "Neither do you," Junho replied pleasantly. "But I suspect you'll find out soon enough. Now, please leave. You're disturbing the other customers, and Rosie's has excellent pie that I'd hate to see go cold because of unpleasantness." For a long moment, the man stood frozen, pride warring with prudence on his face. Then he turned and stalked toward the door, pausing only to look back at Imani, within Junho memorize every feature of his face for future reference. 2 years, he said softly. 2 years I gave you. You'll regret this." The bell chimed as he left, cheerful and obscene in the heavy silence that followed. Junho waited until the man had passed the window, until his figure had disappeared into the swirling snow, until his men had confirmed with subtle nods that he was truly gone. Then he turned back to the booth where Imani sat with tears streaming silently down her face, her hands pressed flat against the table as if anchoring herself to reality. "I believe," he said gently, sliding back into a seat across from her. "You mentioned something about an explanation." He picked up his fork and resumed eating his eggs with the calm of a man who had not just threatened a stranger in a public establishment. "Take your time. The coffee here is excellent, and I find that difficult conversations go better with caffeine." Imani laughed, a broken sound that was half sob, and reached for the mug the waitress had silently deposited during the confrontation. Her hands were still shaking, but the desperate terror had faded from her eyes, replaced by exhaustion and something that looked like the first fragile shoots of relief. "You didn't have to do that," she said, her voice rough. "You don't know me. You don't know anything about me. Why would you?" "Because he frightened you," Junho said simply. "And because I was taught that a man who makes a woman look the way you looked when you walked through that door is not a man at all. He is a problem." He set down his fork and met her eyes with an intensity that made her breath catch. "And I am very good at solving problems." The waitress appeared with a fresh pot of coffee and a slice of apple pie that no one had ordered, setting it down in front of Imani with a pat on her shoulder that spoke volumes about what the staff had witnessed and understood. "On the house, honey," she said quietly. "You look like you could use something sweet." She glanced at Junho with an expression of grudging respect. "Your husband's got good instincts. You hold on to that 1 inch." When she had gone, Imani stared at the pie as if it contained the answers to questions she hadn't yet learned to ask. "His name is Marcus Webb," she said finally, her voice steadier now. "And he's not my boyfriend. He was never my boyfriend, no matter what he tells people. He's my former professor. I was his graduate student at Northwestern, and when I tried to end things I never started, things he imagined into existence, he destroyed my academic career." She looked up at Junho, and there was fire beneath the exhaustion now, the ember of a rage that had been burning for too long without oxygen. "He got me expelled, told the administration I was unstable, that I was stalking him, that I had fabricated our relationship. And everyone believed him because he's Dr. Marcus Webb, tenured professor, published author, respected member of the academic community. She took a sip of coffee, and Junho watched her gather herself, watched her piece together the dignity that men like Marcus Webb spent their lives trying to strip from women like her. I've been running for 8 months. Different cities, different jobs. Always looking over my shoulder. He finds me every time. He has money, connections, resources I can't compete with. And every time he finds me, he makes sure I know that he can reach me whenever he wants. Her jaw tightened. He's never touched me. That's the thing. He's too smart for that. He just appears. Reminds me that I can't escape. Watches me until I run again. She laughed bitterly. The police won't help. There's no crime in showing up at the same restaurant as someone. No crime in being concerned about a former student's mental health. Junho had finished his eggs during her recitation, and now he sat back against the vinyl booth with his hands folded before him, studying her with the same careful attention he gave to business negotiations worth millions. This man, he said slowly, this professor. He has connections, you said. What kind of connections? Imani shrugged, a gesture of helpless frustration. His father is a federal judge. His brother-in-law works for the mayor's office. He golfs with the police commissioner. She met Junho's eyes with defiant despair. He's untouchable. That's what he tells me every time he finds me. That I can run forever, but I'll never be free because the system is designed to protect people like him from people like me. The system, Junho repeated, and something in his smile made Imani's eyes widen.
Yes.
I'm familiar with the system. I'm familiar with the kind of men who believe it exists to serve them. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a card, sliding it across the table to her. It was simple, elegant, bearing only a phone number in embossed black ink. I am not part of their system, Miss Imani. I operate in spaces they cannot reach, by rules they do not understand. And I find that men like your professor often discover, too late, that their connections mean nothing when they anger the wrong people. She picked up the card, turning it over in her fingers as if it might contain some hidden message. Who are you? She asked quietly. Really? Because you're not just some businessman having breakfast, and those men aren't just your colleagues. Junho considered the question, considered the woman before him who had walked into his morning like a storm wrapped in pink wool and desperation. He could lie. He was excellent at lying, had built fortunes on the foundation of carefully constructed untruths. But something in her eyes, something in the way she had trusted him with her story, made him want to offer truth in return. My name is Park Junho, he said, and the syllables carried weight that made his men shift uncomfortably in their booth. Names were power, and he had just handed her a weapon. I am a businessman, as you suspected, but my business operates in territories that exist beyond the reach of judges and commissioners and mayors. I came to Chicago for meetings that have nothing to do with you, and I stopped at this diner because the cook makes eggs that remind me of my grandmother, he smiled, and it was almost gentle. I did not expect to acquire a wife over breakfast, but life is full of surprises. Imani stared at him for a long moment, and he watched her mind work, watched her assemble the pieces he had given her into a picture that should have terrified her. Korean businessman. Men who moved like soldiers. Connections beyond the system. The mathematics were not complicated, and she was clearly intelligent enough to solve the equation. You're telling me you're some kind of criminal, she said flatly. And I should trust you because you helped me with Marcus. I'm telling you that I am a man who solves problems, Junho corrected. The nature of those problems and the methods I employ exist in spaces that your professor's father cannot adjudicate. I am telling you that you walked into this diner looking for salvation, and you found something else entirely. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to something intimate and serious. I am telling you that Marcus Webb has made a mistake today that he does not yet understand, because he threatened a woman in front of me, and I do not forget such things. Why? The word burst from her like a confession. Why do you care? You don't know me. An hour ago, I was a stranger. I'm still a stranger. Why would you involve yourself in my problems? Junho was quiet for a moment, his eyes distant with memories he rarely allowed himself to visit. I had a sister once, he said finally. She was beautiful like you, intelligent like you. She trusted the wrong man, a man with connections, A man who believed the world existed to serve his desires. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. I was young then and powerless, and I could not protect her. By the time I had built myself into something that could challenge such men, she was already gone. He met Imani's eyes, and she saw something ancient and terrible in his gaze. I made a promise over her grave that I would never again stand idle while such men destroyed what they could not possess. It is a promise I have kept for 23 years. The diner had grown quieter around them, the lunch crowd beginning to filter in but giving their booth a wide berth, sensing perhaps the gravity of what was unfolding in that corner. Imani felt tears threatening again, but these were different from the tears of fear she had shed earlier. These came from somewhere deeper, from the part of her that had spent 8 months believing she was utterly alone in her fight. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "About your sister. I'm so sorry." Her name was Sumin, Junho said, and the name fell from his lips like a prayer. "She would have liked you, I think." She had the same fire in her eyes, the same refusal to be broken even when breaking seemed inevitable. He straightened, and the moment of vulnerability passed, replaced by the cool competence that had built his empire.
Now.
"We have practical matters to discuss. Where are you staying? Is it secure?" Imani laughed hollowly. "I'm staying at a motel off the interstate. Paid cash, fake name in the register. It's the best I can do with what I have left." She shook her head. "I was a doctoral candidate in comparative literature. I was going to be a professor. Now I'm working cash jobs and sleeping in places that rent by the week, and every time I start to build something, he finds me and I have to run again." "That ends today," Junho said, and it was not a suggestion. He pulled out his phone and sent a rapid text in Korean, his fingers moving with practiced efficiency. "My people will collect your belongings from the motel and bring them to a secure location. You will stay in one of my properties until this matter is resolved." "It is not charity," he added, seeing her mouth open to protest. "It is strategy. I cannot address the problem of Marcus Webb if I am worried about your immediate safety." "Address the problem," Imani repeated slowly. "What does that mean exactly? What are you going to do to him?" Junho smiled, and it was the smile of a man who had spent decades perfecting the art of making problems disappear. "That depends entirely on him. Some men, when confronted with genuine consequence, choose wisdom. They retreat. They find new obsessions. They learn that the world contains predators larger than themselves." He paused, his expression darkening. "Others require more persuasive demonstrations. I will determine which category your professor falls into, and I will respond accordingly." "You're talking about hurting him. It wasn't a question." "I'm talking about stopping him," Junho corrected. "The method is his choice, not mine. I am not a monster, Miss Imani. I do not enjoy violence for its own sake. But I understand that some men speak no other language, and I am fluent in many tongues." He finished his coffee and set the mug down with finality. "You have been fighting this battle alone with weapons that cannot harm him. His connections, his resources, his respectability, these are armor against the attacks you can mount. But they are not armor against me. I operate in a different arena entirely, one where federal judges hold no sway and police commissioners are merely men with badges." Imani sat with this information, turning it over in her mind like a stone whose weight she was only beginning to comprehend. She should be afraid, she knew. She should be running from this man, just as she had run from Marcus, trading one dangerous figure for another. But something in her, something that had been crushed and buried under 8 months of terror and isolation, recognized the difference between a predator who hunted for pleasure and one who hunted to protect. "Why should I trust you?" she asked finally. "I trusted Marcus once. I trusted the system. I trusted that if I just worked hard enough and followed the rules, everything would be okay. And all of that trust got me here, sitting in a diner with a man who just admitted he's a criminal, considering whether to put my life in his hands." Junho nodded, accepting the question as valid. "You should not trust me because I ask you to. You should trust me because I have given you the truth when lies would have been easier. You should trust me because my men have made no move to prevent you from leaving, and the door remains unguarded." He gestured toward the exit, where indeed no one stood blocking her path. "You should trust me because in the last hour, I have done more to protect you than anyone has done in 8 months, and I have asked nothing in return. But ultimately, Miss Imani, trust is a choice that only you can make. I am offering you an option. I am not demanding you take it. She looked toward the door, toward the snow still falling beyond the fogged windows, toward the world that had offered her nothing but running and fear and the slow erosion of everything she had built. Then she looked back at the man across from her, this stranger who had stepped into her nightmare and faced down her monster without hesitation, who had spoken of a dead sister with grief that time had not diminished, who offered her something she had almost forgotten existed, the possibility of safety. "Okay," she said quietly. "Okay. I'll trust you. God help me, but I'll trust you." Something shifted in Junho's expression, something that might have been respect or might have been something warmer. "Then we begin," he said. Sungjin, one of his men, appeared at the booth instantly, a tall Korean man with a scar running along his jaw and eyes that had seen things Imani didn't want to imagine. "Take Miss Imani to the Parkview property. Ensure she has everything she needs. Post security on all access points." He turned back to Imani. "This is Sungjin. He has been with me for 15 years, and I trust him with my life. He will keep you safe while I attend to other matters." "Other matters," Imani repeated. "You mean Marcus?" "I mean the beginning of Marcus Webb's education," Junho confirmed. "He believes he is untouchable. I am going to demonstrate how profoundly mistaken that belief is." He rose from the booth and buttoned his jacket with precise movements. "You'll stay at the property until I send word that it is safe. You will not contact anyone from your previous life, not yet. And you will try, if you can, to rest. You look like you haven't slept properly in months." "I haven't," she admitted. "Every time I close my eyes, I see him standing outside my window, or sitting in his car across the street, or walking toward me in some public place with that smile that says he's already won." She shuddered. "How do you sleep when someone is always hunting you?" "You don't," Junho said simply. "Not until the hunter becomes the hunted. But that transformation begins today, Miss Imani. I give you my word." He left money on the table, far more than the meal had cost, and walked toward the door with the unhurried pace of a man who owned every room he entered. At the threshold, he paused and looked back at her, this woman in her pink sweater who had stumbled into his life seeking 5 minutes of safety and had found something else entirely. "My grandmother used to say that there are no accidents," he said quietly. "That every meeting is arranged by forces we cannot see, for purposes we cannot understand." I did not believe her when I was young. I was too angry, too hungry, too convinced that I alone controlled my destiny. He smiled, and for a moment he looked almost gentle. "I believe her now. Rest well, Miss Imani. When next we meet, your world will be different." The bell chimed as he left, and Imani sat alone in the booth with her untouched pie and her cooling coffee, trying to process the earthquake that had just reshaped her existence. Sungjin stood at a respectful distance, his presence somehow both intimidating and reassuring, waiting for her to be ready. "Is he always like that?" she asked finally. "Your boss. Is he always so certain?" Sungjin's voice was deep and surprisingly warm.
Yes.
"Mr. Park sees the world very clearly. He sees what is broken, and he fixes it. He sees what is unjust, and he corrects it. It is why we follow him." He moved toward her, offering his hand to help her from the booth. "The car is warm. The property has food, clean clothes, anything you need. You are safe now, Miss Imani. Whatever happens next, you are safe." She took his hand and rose on legs that felt unsteady, the adrenaline of the morning finally beginning to fade into exhaustion. "Imani Grace," she said quietly. "He made up my middle name, but he got it right. How did he do that?" Sungjin smiled, a rare expression that transformed his scarred face into something almost friendly. "Mr. Park has a gift for seeing people. He looks at someone and knows things about them that they have not spoken. It is unsettling at first." He guided her toward the door, his hand hovering near her elbow without quite touching. "You will grow accustomed to it." The cold hit her like a wall when they stepped outside, but a black sedan was already waiting at the curb, its engine running, and its interior glowing with warmth. Sungjin opened the rear door for her, and she slid inside, sinking into leather seats that probably cost more than her last 3 months of motel rooms combined. As the car pulled away from the curb, she looked back at Rosie's diner, at the fogged windows and the cheerful sign and the absolute ordinary normalcy of a place where her entire life had just changed direction. She didn't know what Park Joon-ho would do to Marcus Webb. She didn't know if she wanted to know. But for the first time in 8 months, the knot of terror that had lived in her chest since the day Marcus had first appeared outside her apartment, smiling that smile that promised ownership, began to loosen. She was not alone anymore. She was not powerless anymore. Someone had looked at her situation and declared it unacceptable, and that someone had the means to do something about it. The snow continued to fall as the sedan carried her towards safety, and Imani Grace closed her eyes and allowed herself, for the first time in what felt like forever, to breathe. 3 days passed in the strange, suspended reality of the Parkview property, a luxury apartment in a building that seemed to exist outside the normal flow of Chicago life. Security cameras monitored every entrance. Men with earpieces patrolled the hallways at irregular intervals. Food appeared in the kitchen as if by magic, and anything Imani mentioned wanting, books, clothing, toiletries, materialized within hours. She was a guest, not a prisoner, but she understood that the distinction was largely academic. She could leave whenever she chose. She simply chose not to, because for the first time in 8 months, she slept through the night without waking in terror. On the 4th morning, Sung-jin appeared at her door with an expression that suggested something had changed. "Mr. Park requests your presence," he said formally. "There have been developments." She followed him to a different floor of the building, to an office that looked like it belonged in a corporate headquarters rather than a residential property. Joon-ho sat behind a massive desk, his jacket removed and his sleeves rolled to his elbows, looking more human than he had in the diner. More tired, too, she noticed. Whatever he had been doing for the past 3 days had cost him something. "Miss Imani," he said, rising to greet her. "Please sit. We have much to discuss." She took the chair across from his desk, noting the folder that sat between them, thick with documents and photographs. "You found something," she said. It wasn't a question. "I found everything," Joon-ho corrected. "Your professor has been busy, Miss Imani. You are not his first victim. You are merely his most recent." He opened the folder and spread its contents across the desk, and Imani felt her stomach drop as she recognized face after face, woman after woman, a gallery of lives that Marcus Webb had touched and destroyed. 7 women in the past 12 years. All graduate students. All brilliant. All destroyed when they rejected his advances or threatened to expose him. 7. Imani whispered. There were 7 others? That I could find evidence of, Joon-ho said grimly. The actual number may be higher. His pattern is consistent. He selects vulnerable students, preferably those without strong family connections or financial resources. He cultivates them, makes himself indispensable to their academic careers, and then he makes his move. When they resist, he deploys his connections to discredit them. Expulsion. Blacklisting. Restraining orders filed against the victims rather than the perpetrator. His jaw tightened. He is a predator who has refined his methods over more than a decade, and the system has protected him at every turn. Imani stared at the photographs, at the faces of women she had never met but whose experiences mirrored her own. What happened to them? The others? 2 left academia entirely and rebuilt their lives in other fields. 3 moved to other countries to escape his reach. 1-inch Joon-ho paused, and something dark passed across his features. 1 took her own life 4 years ago. Her name was Rebecca Chen. She was 26 years old and had been accepted to a prestigious postdoctoral program before Marcus Webb decided she belonged to him. The name hit Imani like a physical blow. She had heard of Rebecca Chen, had read about her death in academic circles, had accepted the official narrative of a troubled young woman who couldn't handle the pressures of graduate school. The truth was so much worse. The truth was that Rebecca Chen had been murdered as surely as if Marcus Webb had pulled a trigger, and no one had ever held him accountable. I'm going to be sick, Imani said quietly, and she meant it literally, her stomach roiling with horror and rage and the terrible weight of understanding. Joon-ho pushed a glass of water toward her, his expression patient. Take your time. This is difficult information to process. Difficult? She laughed, and it was a broken sound. He killed her. Maybe not with his hands, but he killed her. And he's still out there, still teaching, still selecting his next victim. She looked up at Junho with eyes that burned. What are you going to do about it? That depends on you, Junho said carefully. I have options, Miss Imani. Many options. Some of them are permanent and would ensure that Marcus Webb never harms another woman. But those options would also mean that you would never have justice in any conventional sense. No trial. No public acknowledgement of what he did. No restoration of your reputation or your career. He leaned forward, his gaze intense. Other options are slower but more thorough. They involve exposure, documentation, the careful dismantling of every protection he has built around himself. They would take longer, and they would require your participation, but they would leave him alive to face the consequences of his actions in the world he thought would always protect him. Imani sat with this choice, feeling its weight settle onto her shoulders like a mantle she had never asked to wear. The easy path called to her, the path that would simply make Marcus Webb disappear and allow her to rebuild her life without ever looking over her shoulder again. But Rebecca Chen's face stared up at her from the folder, and the faces of 6 other women who had suffered in silence, and she knew that disappearance was not justice. Disappearance was just another kind of erasure, another way for the system to avoid confronting what it had allowed to flourish. The second option, she said finally. I want him exposed. I want everyone to know what he is. I want his father, the judge, to read about his son's crimes in the newspaper. I want his colleagues to understand that they protected a monster, her voice hardened into something sharp and bright. I want him to lose everything he used against us, and I want to watch it happen. Junho smiled, and it was the smile of a man who had hoped for exactly this answer. Then we have work to do. I have already begun reaching out to the other survivors. 2 of them have agreed to speak with you, to share their stories, to consider the possibility of coming forward together. There is strength in numbers, Miss Imani. 1 woman can be dismissed as unstable. 7 women are a pattern that even federal judges cannot ignore. You found them, Imani breathed. You actually found them, and they're willing to talk. They've been waiting for someone to listen, Junho said simply. They've been waiting for someone to believe them. They've been waiting for the chance to stop running and start fighting. He closed the folder and set it aside. I have also taken certain preliminary steps to limit Dr. Webb's mobility. His passport has encountered administrative difficulties. His bank accounts have experienced unusual freezes pending investigation of suspicious activity. His university has received anonymous tips regarding potential Title IX violations that require immediate review. The smile widened slightly. He is discovering that the system which protected him can also be turned against him when properly motivated.
How?
Imani asked. How did you do all of that in 3 days? I told you that I operate in spaces beyond the reach of judges and commissioners, Junho reminded her. I did not tell you that those spaces have their own connections, their own leverage, their own ways of making things happen. Marcus Webb believed his network made him invincible. He did not account for the possibility that someone might possess a larger network with fewer scruples about using it. The next weeks blurred together in a whirlwind of activity that Imani could barely process. She met the other survivors, first through video calls and then in person, women who had been strangers united by their shared trauma and their shared determination to finally be heard. There was Dominique, who had left academia to become a social worker and who wept when she learned she was not alone. There was Priya, who had fled to London and built a new life, but had never stopped looking over her shoulder. There was Michelle, who had been the first 15 years ago, when Marcus Webb was just beginning to perfect his methods. Together, they built a case that no amount of connections could suppress. They documented everything, every email, every threat. They found witnesses who had seen things and stayed silent, colleagues who had suspected but never spoken, administrators who had chosen institutional reputation over student safety. They built a mountain of evidence that would bury Marcus Webb so completely that even his father's judicial robes could not dig him out. Junho remained in Chicago throughout, overseeing the operation with the same meticulous attention he brought to his business dealings. He provided resources, connections, protection. He ensured that Marcus Webb could not reach any of the women, could not intimidate them into silence, could not deploy his usual tactics of isolation and terror. When Webb hired private investigators to find Imani, they found instead very persuasive men who convinced them to drop the case and refund their clients' money. When Webb attempted to file false police reports, those reports disappeared into bureaucratic limbo from which they would never emerge. "He's panicking," Sung Jin reported one evening, a hint of satisfaction in his usually stoic voice. "Our sources say he hasn't slept in days. He's calling in every favor, trying to understand what's happening, but no one will help him. They can smell blood in the water." "Good," Imani said, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. "Let him feel what we felt. Let him understand what it's like to be hunted." The story broke on a Tuesday morning, 6 weeks after Imani had stumbled into Rosie's diner seeking 5 minutes of safety. A major newspaper ran the investigation across 3 pages, featuring interviews with 5 of the 7 survivors, documented evidence of systematic abuse and institutional cover-up, and damning quotes from former colleagues who had finally found the courage to speak. By noon, Marcus Webb had been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. By evening, his attorney had released a statement denying all allegations. By the following morning, 2 more women had come forward with stories that hadn't been included in the original investigation, and the university had announced that Dr. Webb's employment had been terminated effective immediately. Imani watched the coverage from the Parkview apartment, surrounded by women who had become her sisters in survival, and felt something she had almost forgotten existed: hope. Not just for herself, but for every woman who had ever been told that her abuser was too powerful to challenge, too connected to confront, too protected to punish. "It's not over," Priya warned, her British accent soft with caution. "He'll fight this. He'll claim we're all lying, that we coordinated some conspiracy against him. His lawyers will drag this out for years." "Let them try," Dominique said fiercely. "We have the truth, and we have each other, and we have—" She glanced toward the door where Sung Jin stood guard. "We have friends in unusual places." Junho appeared that evening, looking more relaxed than Imani had ever seen him. He brought champagne and Korean food from a restaurant that didn't officially exist, and he sat with the women as they celebrated their first real victory in battles that had lasted years. "This is only the beginning," he reminded them gently. "Criminal charges will take time. Civil suits will take longer. His family will deploy every resource to protect him. But you have changed the narrative. You have made it impossible for the world to ignore what he is. That is a victory that cannot be taken from you." "Thank you," Imani said, and the words felt inadequate for everything he had done. "I don't know how to thank you for what you've given us. I don't even know how to begin." Junho shook his head slowly. "You owe me nothing, Miss Imani. I told you once that I made a promise over my sister's grave. Every time I help someone like you, I keep that promise. Every time a man like Marcus Webb faces consequences, Suman's death means something." He raised his glass in a toast. "To the women who refused to stay silent. To the survivors who became warriors. To justice, however long it takes to arrive." They drank to that, and for a moment the apartment was filled with something that felt almost like joy. The criminal trial began 8 months later, after a grand jury had reviewed the evidence and returned indictments on multiple counts of stalking, harassment, and intimidation. Marcus Webb sat at the defense table, looking like a ghost of the confident predator who had walked into Rosie's diner, his expensive suit hanging loose on a frame that had lost weight from stress and sleepless nights. His father sat in the gallery, his judicial authority meaningless in a courtroom where he held no power, watching his son's carefully constructed life collapse under the weight of testimony from 7 women who would not be silenced. Imani testified on the 3rd day, her voice steady and clear as she recounted every manipulation, every threat, every moment of terror that Marcus Webb had inflicted upon her. She looked at him as she spoke, refusing to let him see her fear, refusing to give him the satisfaction of knowing that even now, even with everything that had changed, some part of her still flinched at the memory of his smile. "He told me I could never escape," she said, her eyes locked on his. "He told me the system would always protect him. He told me I was nothing, and no one would ever believe me." She paused, letting the silence stretch. He was wrong about all of it. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. The judge, who was not Marcus Webb's father and who had no interest in protecting academic predators, sentenced him to 12 years in federal prison with no possibility of early parole. As the bailiffs led him away in handcuffs, Marcus Webb looked back at the gallery where Imani sat surrounded by her sisters in survival, and for the first time, she saw something in his eyes that she recognized. Fear. "How does it feel?" Dominique whispered, squeezing her hand. "Like breathing," Imani replied. "Like finally being able to breathe." The civil suits followed, resulting in settlements that would never fully compensate for what had been taken but would at least provide financial security for women who had lost careers and years of their lives. Northwestern University issued a formal apology and established a fund for survivors of academic misconduct. Rebecca Chen's family received a settlement that they used to create a scholarship in her name, ensuring that her memory would be tied rather than tragedy. And Imani Grace, who had walked into a diner seeking 5 minutes of safety, found herself standing at a podium 2 years later, accepting a position as the director of a new advocacy organization dedicated to supporting survivors of institutional abuse. The audience applauded as she took her place, and she looked out at the faces before her, at the women she had fought alongside, at the supporters who had believed in their cause, at the one face she had not expected to see. Park Joon-ho sat in the back row, dressed in his usual impeccable suit, watching her with an expression that might have been pride. Beside him sat Sung-jin, still scarred and still watchful, still guarding the man he had followed for nearly 2 decades. They had not spoken in months, worlds having diverged once the immediate crisis had passed, but he had come. He had come to see what she had built from the ashes of what Marcus Webb had tried to destroy. After the ceremony, after the handshakes and the photographs and the interviews, she found him waiting by a window overlooking the city. The sun was setting over Chicago, painting the skyline in shades of gold and amber, and for a moment they simply stood together in comfortable silence. "You came," she said finally. "I wanted to see," he replied. "I wanted to see what you had become. And what have I become?" He turned to look at her, and there was something in his eyes that she had never seen before, something soft and wondering. "You have become exactly what I knew you would be that first day in the diner. A warrior. A protector. Someone who turns her pain into purpose and her fear into fire." He smiled, and it reached his eyes in a way his smiles rarely did. "My grandmother would have said that our meeting was arranged by forces we cannot see." I believe she was right. "I never properly thanked you," Imani said. "For everything. Me when you had no reason to. For fighting for me when you had nothing to gain. For giving me the chance to become this." "You thanked me by becoming this," Joon-ho said simply. "You thanked me by refusing to let what happened to you happen to others. You thanked me by proving that the system can be changed, that predators can be stopped, that survivors can become something more than their survival." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object, pressing it into her palm. "I have something for you. A gift. For this new chapter of your life." She looked down at her hand and found a small jade pendant, carved in the shape of a tiger, worn smooth by years of handling. "What is this?" "It belonged to my sister," Joon-ho said quietly. "She wore it every day until the day she died. I've carried it with me ever since, a reminder of the promise I made." He closed her fingers around it gently. "I think she would want you to have it now. I think she would want it to protect someone who is still fighting, rather than sit in the pocket of an old man who has already won his battles." Imani felt tears threatening, felt the weight of what he was giving her, the trust and the memory and the love that this small piece of jade represented. "I can't accept this. It's too precious. It's all you have left of her." "No," Joon-ho said, shaking his head. "What I have left of her is the promise I made and the work I have done to keep it. What I have left of her is you and Dominique and Priya and Michelle and every woman I have helped in her name." He smiled again, and this time there was peace in it, a peace that Imani suspected he had been seeking for 23 years. "The jade is just a stone. The legacy is what matters. And you are her legacy now, Miss Imani. You are proof that her death meant something." They stood together as the sun finished its descent, as the city lights began to flicker on across the skyline, as the world continued its eternal turning. Two people whose lives had intersected in a moment of desperation and had been changed forever by the connection. Will I see you again? Imani asked. Perhaps, Junho said. My work takes me many places. Chicago is not always among them. But I will be watching, Miss Imani. I will be watching what you build, and I will be proud. He turned to leave, Sungjin falling into step beside him, but paused at the door. One more thing. The diner. Rosie's. The cook retired last year, and the new owner was going to close it. I bought the building. Kept it open. Kept the same menu. He smiled over his shoulder. In case anyone else needs a place to run to someday. In case anyone else needs 5 minutes of safety that turns into something more. Then he was gone, disappearing into the evening with the same quiet certainty with which he had entered her life, leaving Imani standing by the window with a jade tiger in her palm and tears on her cheeks and a future stretching before her that she had never dared to imagine. 5 years later, Imani Grace stood at the window of her office, watching the snow fall over Chicago with a peace she had earned through fire and determination. The advocacy organization she directed had helped hundreds of survivors, had changed policies at universities across the country, had built a network of support that reached from coast to coast. The jade tiger hung around her neck, warm against her skin, a constant reminder of the man who had given her the chance to become who she was meant to be. On her desk sat a photograph from the grand opening of the Rebecca Chin Memorial Center, a facility that provided free legal services and counseling to survivors of institutional abuse. In the photograph, 7 women stood together, arms linked, smiling at the camera with the fierce joy of people who had walked through hell and emerged stronger. Dominique, Priya, Michelle, the others who had found their voices and used them to change the world. And in the corner of the photograph, barely visible, stood a man in an expensive suit with silver at his temples, watching the celebration with an expression of quiet satisfaction. Imani touched the photograph gently, then turned back to the window. The snow was beautiful today, soft and white and clean, covering the city in a blanket that made everything look new. Somewhere out there, she knew, another woman was running. Another woman was afraid. Another woman was looking for 5 minutes of safety in a world that too often failed to provide it. But now there were places to run to. Now there were people who would believe. Now there was a network of survivors and advocates and unlikely allies who would stand between the predators and their prey. We're ready for you, Director Grace, her assistant called from the doorway. The new intake coordinator is here for her interview. Imani smiled and turned from the window, the jade tiger warm against her heart. Send her in. The work continued. The legacy grew. And somewhere, she liked to believe, a woman named Sumin was finally at peace, knowing that her brother had kept his promise and that her death had given birth to something beautiful. The snow kept falling over Chicago, soft and white and full of possibility, and Imani Grace walked forward into a future she had built from the ashes of her fear, one survivor at a time.